Dean, Dr. Lee, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, can I say what a pleasure and privilege it is to deliver a lecture which carries the name of Dr. Lee, who has been such a distinguished business leader in Singapore during its spectacular ascent in the last decades, and who has also been a great philanthropist, not least to the university which I know best. I'd also like to say what a pleasure it is to speak at a function organized by the RSIS, which we work with closely and with considerable pleasure at Oxford University. So thank you very much indeed for the invitation. Woody Allen once announced that he'd done a speed reading course and had read War and Peace in 20 minutes. It's about Russia, he said. I don't imagine that in 20 minutes he managed the essays at the end of War and Peace, nor I think do most readers of that great novel do so, in which Tolstoy sets out his view of history, and in particular his views on the nature of power. It's a subject which greatly interested him, partly because of his fascination with Napoleon Bonaparte, and also because of his fascination with what it was that had enabled the French army to penetrate so far into Russia, though having done so, they came, as you will recall, to a calamitous conclusion, leading Field Marshal Lord Mountbatten in the last war to say that the first law of warfare should be never march on Moscow. So what exactly is power? And does it matter to a country and its prosperity, peace, and happiness, whether or not it possesses power? On the whole, in answering that question, most people would probably go along with the American humorist and short story writer Damon Runyon, who once wrote, "The race is not always to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, but that's the best way to bet." So what defines swiftness and what defines strength in global politics? The first frequent determinant of power is sheer size. Part of the reason why Europe was so dominant in the 19th century was that its population increased from 1/5 of the total world population to 1/4. This, of course, created its own problems. There was mass emigration from Europe to the Americas, to Asia, and to Africa, with considerable political and cultural consequences. There was also pressure on the space in Europe, which helped to produce the environment in which Europeans fought 3 wars between 1870 and 1945. The increased population in Europe enjoyed per capita incomes which had risen dramatically in comparison with, say, India and China since the 1500s. Economic strength has always been an important ingredient of power. The period when the United Kingdom was undoubtedly dominant in world affairs, from about 1845 to 1870, was a period during which the United Kingdom was responsible for about 30% of world output. It also had considerable military power and was prepared to deploy it, sometimes disastrously, as in South Africa with the Boer War, which helped to end Britain's dominance globally. Strong states, economically and militarily, have throughout history, since, for example, the Peloponnesian Wars in ancient Greece, which we read about in Thucydides, been the main danger to peace. They swallowed smaller and weaker states as the Athenians swallowed the Delians. But today, the problem we face is rather different. On the whole, it's not strong states that cause problems, but weak ones, exporting their problems which can't be ghettoized in our intimately interconnected world. So we worry most about Somalia, about Afghanistan, about Burma, about Zimbabwe, about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, all of which pollute politically and sometimes in other ways their regional neighborhood. And we worry rather more about the consequences of state institutions weakening further in Pakistan and in Mexico, where government is being hollowed out by the drug wars. For 18 out of the last 20 centuries, China has been the biggest economy in the world. It's not very surprising, since it's the largest country. India has been the other big player. Together, at the beginning of the 19th century, India and China represented about 50% of the world's GDP. Even though, as I said earlier, Europe had been surpassing China and India for some time in per capita wealth growth. In the 19th and 20th century, that share of GDP fell dramatically from 50% to 7 or 8% by 1970. The reasons why India and China fell so far behind are in some ways more complex than the reasons why they're currently flourishing. There are several of them. There was colonial exploitation, about which my own country knows a good deal. There was in China, whose economy was globalized by force through the opium trade in order to protect the Indian balance of payments, another example of colonialism. In China, in addition to colonial exploitation, there was also civil war, there was the invasion by Japan, and there was manic totalitarianism. But for a generation, certainly for 30 years, we've started to see things turn in India and China. It began with Deng Xiaoping's reforms in China at the end of the 1970s, and in India it began with the first steps to dismantle the license Raj taken in the early 1990s in response to a foreign exchange crisis. The turnaround has been astonishing. China now exports in a day as much as it did in a year in 1978. India now invests more in Britain, substantially more in Britain, than Britain invests in India. What has happened in China and India follows, of course, the dramatic economic advances in Japan and in the so-called Asian tiger economies like Singapore in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. If anything, this latest Asian surge has been less dramatic and less broadly based than the first. But like the first, it's depended crucially on the opening up of markets, especially the opening up of the American market. And what has happened recently in China and India has lain at the heart of the latest dramatic advance in globalization. The two really major transformations wrought by globalization came in the late 19th century and again over the last 20 or 30 years at the end of the 20th century. Both had similar causes. In the 19th century, we saw technological developments, steamships, railway trains, telegraphy. We saw those things allied with trade liberalization, in which Britain took the lead. And we also saw the opening up of the American Midwest to produce the dramatic growth in the last part of the 19th century, to produce the deflationary boom whose consequences Lord Keynes wrote about in his great book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. The second and recent changes have been similar. We've seen technology, containerization, air travel, mobile telephony, information technology, combined again with the dismantling of trade barriers, and, which is in a sense the equivalent today of the opening up of the Midwest, the fact that 2.5 billion Indians and Chinese have in the last 30 years joined the world economy. Overall, this hugely beneficial process, though not without problems, has transformed people's lives in continent after continent. Hundreds of millions have been lifted out of poverty. The increase in purchasing power in some countries has meant the increase in production in others. The geography of that production has changed. Relative advantage has shifted from one place to another. But overall, from continent to continent, the benefits of globalization have far outstripped the downside. The famous left-wing Cambridge economist Joan Robinson, who dwelt on the fringes of Marxism, used to say that the people who were worst off were those whose labor was not being exploited by capitalists. Certainly there's some bitter truth about that. Looking back at the 20th century, we can see that it was dominated by the rise of America and the breakdown and then the rebuilding of Europe. Europe was torn apart by two xenophobic world wars. America came to Europe's assistance on each occasion. After the first, America declined to stay behind and turned in on itself in the 1920s and 30s. But after the second, it stayed behind, encouraged Europe on the path of economic and political integration, which we've seen in the last decades, and on the understanding that Europe would bury its xenophobic nationalist instincts. America agreed that it would help defend Europe against Soviet totalitarianism. America shaped the world order with help from its transatlantic partners in Europe. It was dominant in creating the institutions of global government at the UN and the Bretton Woods. It exported democracy, often successfully. It encouraged the sharing of sovereignty in unique ways, as I've said, in Europe. And it opened its markets to the world encouraging others to practice something like its brand of capitalism. It was, in a real sense, an emporium more than an imperium. But it certainly possessed the military muscle of an old-fashioned empire. Perhaps it's surprising in retrospect that it was not more profligate in its use of force. There's much talk about the United States losing its global preeminence and about us living today in a more multipolar world, reshaped by the arrival of the emerging economies, in particular the so-called BRICS, Goldman Sachs' brilliant acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. There is some truth in this, but much of what has happened isn't the result of the changing relationship between the United States and others, but the general fact that no country today, however mighty, can cope on its own with global problems that increasingly demand global solutions. Nor should the relative rise of other countries, their recovery from the surprising decline of the two past centuries, make us exaggerate the change in America's status. America is still the world's only superpower. It's the only country which matters everywhere. It's the largest economy in the world. It has been since the 1880s. Even though it's never had more than 5% of the world's population, for 125 years, it's been responsible for between 20 and 30% of the world's output. America has complete mastery of the global commons, of land, sea, air, and space. While its military expenditure has fallen since the Cold War, it spends about 50% of the total global spend on military technology. Of course, it has its own share of problems. Its political system includes checks and balances which were perhaps more appropriate to the 18th or 19th century than to today's world. They sometimes seem to have condemned America to acrimonious drift. America can commit itself to investing $1 trillion in rebuilding Iraq and Afghanistan, but has difficulty finding any resources to modernize its own infrastructure. But for all this and more, America is still, as I've said, the only country which matters everywhere. Name almost any global problem, and it's impossible to see how it can be successfully tackled without American leadership. Perhaps above all, we should recognize, particularly those of us who are associated with higher education and research, we should recognize America's huge soft power. Most of the rest of the world sees America as a land of opportunity. Getting an American green card is like winning the lottery of life. Perhaps it's especially true of the world's best and brightest. 42 of the world's top 50 universities are American. Indian universities graduate between 35 and 50 PhDs each year in computer science. America graduates 1,000. Foreign students and immigrants represent 50% of the science researchers in the United States. A third of those working at NASA are Indians. About 75% of all science PhDs which will be completed in America this year will be completed by foreign students. As a consequence, half of all Silicon Valley's startups have one founder at least who's an immigrant or a first-generation American. All this represents the sort of power that no one else can yet match. In much of the discussion of the global power balance in the 21st century, Europe doesn't really get a look in. Again, this exaggerates the change in Europe's fortunes. It's true that Europe's population will fall over the first half of this century, perhaps by as much as 20%. The steepest falls, I merely comment, are coming in those countries which have the longest Catholic traditions. Europe's population is also aging. Therefore, without changes in our underlying low growth rate in Europe, Europe will find itself during the first part of the century with a fall not only in its share of world population, but of world trade and world output. But that shouldn't make a European too gloomy. We shouldn't forget our starting point. With only 7% of the world's population, the European Union generates almost 22% of the world's wealth. That's more than the United States, 21%, almost twice as much as China, 11.5%, about 4 to 5 times as much as India, 4.7%. Europe has created an extraordinarily successful single market. It has a single trade policy, a single environment policy. It shared and transformed sovereignty in unique ways in a surprisingly large number of areas. It enjoys, give or take, the odd demonstration, political stability, and it's been so successful that it's helped promote change around its expanding borders through its own example and the success of its own model. This is, in a way, its existential problem. Europeans think, not without some justification, that they enjoy the best quality of life in the world. But they're increasingly reluctant to accept the changes which are necessary in order to sustain that way of life. Success has made them deeply conservative with a small c. And too many of the leaders of European polities lack courage and conviction in tackling that problem. One European Prime Minister was quoted recently as saying, "Of course," he said, "we know what needs to be done, but we don't know how we get re-elected if we do it." The big challenge for Europe today is to come to terms with the need to earn the entitlements that we believe we deserve. And that's not going to be terribly easy. Europeans look with interest and admiration at what is happening in China, which has smashed its iron rice bowl, and India and the rest of Asia. And on the whole, Europeans have not tried to lock the gates against Asian competition. What do they see in China? They know that China now is the second largest economy in the world, probably has been for some time. They know that it's the world's biggest exporter. They know that it's the #1 consumer of energy. They recognize that China has become the world's workshop. Go into any bookshop in a European capital and you see shelf after shelf crammed with books, volumes that are themselves packed with gee-whiz statistics and predictions about China. It is an extraordinary story. For 30 years, doubling the economy every 8 years. And it's a story which has helped to make the whole world much better off. But there are some features that puzzle outsiders, and I think I merely reflect the comment that you would see in most Western newspapers and certainly European newspapers. First, we look at the recent period. Biodiversity. First, we look at the recent period when the global economy has been growing most rapidly. From 2000 to 2007, the world economy grew at its fastest pace for 4 decades. Per capita income grew at 3.2% a year, the fastest ever recorded. The principal drivers of that growth, in some years between 2000 and 2007, responsible for half the global growth, have been Chinese exports, exports to the West, exports to the US went up by over 1,600% over 15 years. And secondly, the American deficit, which soared. America became the world's borrower of last resort. Domestic borrowing in the United States from the mid-1970s to 2007, to the housing crash, increased from 680 billion to 14 trillion. At the outset of the recession, American households on average had 13 credit cards, with 40% of them owing money. The US borrowed to buy whatever the rest of the world made. And in East Asia, in China, for example, governments bought up American treasury bonds as part of a sort of implicit bargain. America kept its markets open, America went on spending money that it hadn't earned, and East Asia went on paying the price. There's a great American economist called Herb Stein, whose first law of economics was things that can't go on forever don't. And what was for sure was that that couldn't go on forever. But how do we correct this imbalance, which is nudging American politics in a protectionist direction with unemployment still high and a sense that part of the American middle class has been permanently blighted by the competitiveness of Asia and in particular China? China seems increasingly to outsiders, and not just members of the US Congress, to be reluctant to accept its responsibilities as a major economic power. It's worth recalling that people said that of the United States in the 1920s, and they said that of Japan in the 1960s and 70s. Unless outsiders argue there is some adjustment of the renminbi, the danger is that America and much of the rest of the world will become more protectionist. The second question which people outside raise about China is whether the economic model is sustainable. The existing model depends heavily on exports and on investment in infrastructure, which is bound to slow as need for new roads and railways reduces. The competitiveness of exports is largely based on low costs. Chinese labor per hour costs about 2.7% of the price of American counterparts. The share of workers' wages in national income during the decade of rapid growth after 1997 fell dramatically from 53% to just 40%. Personal consumption represents only about 35% of China's GDP, while 11.5% of GDP is invested in foreign assets, usually with rather low returns. Not surprisingly, we're starting to see the demand for higher wages and some examples, not just at Honda, of industrial action. This is likely to increase because of demography. The number of Chinese workers aged 15 to 29 will fall quite sharply after next year. University applications in China have now declined for 2 years in a row. So maybe we're seeing the beginning of the end of a period of substantial surplus labour. The question for China is how to manage the shift from an exporting and manufacturing economy based on low labour costs to an economy growing perhaps a little more slowly, but with increasing consumption and growing expenditure on services and more production for domestic purchase rather than for purchase overseas. These economic issues stand alongside three slightly different questions about China's development, which you often hear asked in the West. First, how will China respond to calls for it to share greater responsibility for coping with global environmental problems, and how will it cope with its domestic environmental problems like air pollution and water stress? Second, can China continue to relax the party's control over the economy while the party continues to retain control over the state? Is greater political accountability off the agenda in China? And thirdly, what role does China want to play in the world? Clearly and wholly reasonably, it wants greater representation in the institutions of global governance. Is there any political agenda, though, about the drive into Africa and Latin America, or is it simply old-fashioned commodity diplomacy, such as America and Europe have practiced in the past? Are China's neighbours, from Vietnam to Japan, right to worry about its strategic ambitions in the Spratlys, the Yellow Sea and the South China Sea? China is clearly going to play a major role in shaping the 21st century. We should all want China to continue to be a hugely successful economy in order to play a constructive and responsible role. But does China actually know what it wants to do? And will its role reduce or add to global insecurity? India raises different questions in the minds of its friends and admirers. If you're an American or a European, however much you want a good relationship with China, you're bound to have a qualitatively different relationship with India. This is not because, unless you're extremely stupid, you want to try to manipulate India as a democratic pawn in a future geostrategic struggle with China. That would be a crazy aim, and anyway, the Indians are far too smart to let anything like that happen. But because Indians value as much, because Indian values are much the same as those in North America and Europe, the belief in pluralism, in democracy and the rule of law, we feel more comfortable with them. And of course, they speak the English language in their own inimitable way. India has been overtaken by China over the last 50 years in the growth stakes. In 1960, India's GDP per capita was higher than China's. Today, it's less than 2/3 of China's. But India has done spectacularly well in a number of areas: business services, information technology, mobile telephony, pharmaceuticals. Moreover, it succeeded in building well-managed, world-class companies which set global benchmarks: Tata, Ranbaxy, Reliance, Infosys, and many others. Indian society is almost certainly far more globalized than Indian politics and government. Society is strong, the state is weak, though it has as its center probably the most economically literate political leadership in the world. But India has to overcome systemic problems in order to begin catching up with China. There is too much corruption. Parts of its political system have been criminalized. There's inadequate investment in infrastructure, which the government is admittedly now addressing. Social inequity has triggered rural unrest. India is home to 40% of the world's poorest. Nevertheless, economic change has lifted unprecedented numbers out of abject poverty, and there is a growing middle class. There's also an instinct for hustling, which helps fuel enterprise. There's also healthy competition between different states and cities for investment and growth. India has managed with extraordinary diversity, thanks to considerable political skill and generosity. I wish that it didn't see so much of global politics almost entirely through the prism of its relationship with Pakistan, but I guess that extremist terrorist attacks make it difficult to ignore that issue. But let me return to a point I made earlier as I come to my final remarks. The re-emergence of China and India on the global stage strongly underlines the argument that no single country can deal with the world's problems on its own. Even the biggest countries have to engage with others rather than confront them. They have to work multilaterally wherever they can. Even the biggest have an interest in recognizing that writing a rule book that everyone can accept makes sense for the powerful as well as the weak, and that the greatest authority and power comes through seeming to do what is legitimate. All those factors are relevant as we tackle the biggest issues of the next years. They're relevant to tackling climate change. They're relevant to trying to prevent the global economy stalling with a stuttering recovery aborted by continuing imbalances and growing protectionism. They're relevant to an issue which we really need to get serious about, namely nuclear proliferation. This isn't a Western obsession. It's a matter of concern for everyone. How do we deal with North Korea and Iran? Those aren't issues that can be simply wished away. There are two other questions which are raised by the economic strength of Asia and its political implications. One is institutional, the other is, in a sense, cultural. The institution question is simple. Is it possible to rejuvenate the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions, and to revive their political authority? If so, we will have to address the balance of power in organizations which reflect the world of the 1940s. The alternative is the adhocracy of the G8 morphed into the G20. That inevitably means that the biggest political and economic issues are decided by the most powerful countries. The small have to fend for themselves or group together in larger sovereignty-sharing regional organizations. The cultural issue is more complex. The colonial era and then the dominance of the transatlantic community in the 20th century led many to identify the modern world and modernization with the West. At several levels, that's a rather trite point. You can clearly be very modern and wear a sari. You can clearly be very modern and be a Buddhist monk with a laptop. In any event, all that one is really saying is that economic dominance invariably means that you also set the technological and intellectual pace. In the last centuries of the first millennium after Christ, would you have identified the modern world with the Christian West in turmoil or with Islam? Islam, famous for its science, for its medical research, and even for saving the great works of the classical world for Western Europe. For much of its history, as gunpowder and printing and so much else came from China, you would have been excused for identifying the modern world with Asia. More recently, the modern world has been associated with what Francis Fukuyama thought had reached its final triumph with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the triumph of liberal political and economic values. There's another argument which overlays this. It suggests that differences between cultures are fundamental. Asia, for example, is naturally Confucian and different from the West, and that the Western modern world is now in decline, outpaced by a distinctively more hierarchical, diligent, and obedient Asian culture. I've always thought that these cultural arguments were pretty ropey, and given the wide disparity of political systems, religions, ethnicities, and cultures within Asia itself, I have difficulty signing up to them. But what is undoubtedly true is that the Western assumption that we have a monopoly of virtue in politics and success in economics is absurd and ahistorical. We like to think of our own contribution to the modern world as our commitment to pluralism, democratic government, the rule of law, civil liberties, open markets, and freedom. Others see Westernization as vulgar, meretricious, domineering, and hypocritical. Naturally, the truth is that you can find good and bad in most systems. You can find examples of falling well below good intentions and principles. No sensible European or Asian looking at our history in the last century would claim, surely, a monopoly of virtue. But what I do believe to be true is that there are better and worse ways of doing things and values that are genuinely universal. Maybe with the re-emergence of the economic power of over 2.5 billion Chinese and Indians, the world has spun off onto a different set of rails. But I suspect that the countries which will exercise most authority and influence and be most competitive, wherever those new rails take us, will display at least some of the following attributes. They are most likely to be pluralist, to encourage civil society and public accountability, because those are the best guarantees of flexibility, quality, and clean government. Those are also qualities which are most likely to trigger further advances in information technology, which is itself liberating to the individual. They are countries, societies, which will give priority not just to education, but, if you'll excuse me sounding like an old-fashioned Tory, to high culture. The sense that education is about more than utilitarianism, because that will give them the solidarity of tradition and legacy. They're countries and societies whose citizens will feel an identification with shared values much more profoundly than common blood ties. They will display a civic humanism. And there'll be societies which accept that all human affairs should be governed by fair rules fairly arrived at. We're told that we live in a post-modern world. I think it's a pretty ludicrous phrase. I think that all that it means is that today is, in a literal sense, more modern than yesterday. But I suspect that it's not a world in which dominance of this or that country will be the principal arbiter of events. I think it's much more likely that the 21st century will be shaped by ideas and values, the sort of values and ideas which I've tried to enumerate in the last few moments. Thank you very much indeed.